There's a weapon that was laughed out of American armories, dismissed as obsolete, and left to rust in forgotten warehouses. Military experts called it primitive. Budget analysts called it wasteful. Defense contractors pushed it aside for shinier, more expensive alternatives. For decades, this weapon sat in the shadows of military history, a relic from a war that ended before most soldiers today were born. Today, that same weapon is tearing through the most fortified positions on Earth. It's destroying tanks that cost millions of dollars with rockets that cost less than a used car. The soldiers who face it call it unstoppable. The soldiers who carry it call it a lifesaver. And military historians are rewriting their textbooks trying to understand how they got it so wrong. This is the story of a weapon that refused to die, a weapon that traveled from American rejection to global resurrection, a weapon that proves the most important rule in warfare: simplicity survives when complexity fails. How does something rejected become irreplaceable? The answer will change everything you think you know about modern war.
In the middle of World War II, the United States military developed a shoulder-fired rocket launcher designed to punch through tank armor. Engineers called it the M1 rocket launcher, but soldiers gave it a nickname that would echo through history: the bazooka. The name came from a musical instrument used by a radio comedian named Bob Burns, who played a homemade horn that looked remarkably like the new weapon. Nobody thought this simple tube would change warfare forever. By 1942, American factories were stamping out bazookas by the thousands, shipping them to every theater of war from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. But when the fighting ended in 1945, military planners looked at the weapon with fresh eyes and decided it was finished. Too simple, they said, too crude for modern war, too embarrassing for a superpower military that wanted to project technological dominance. By the 1950s and 1960s, the bazooka was being phased out of U.S. arsenals, replaced by more sophisticated systems with fancy guidance electronics, complex firing mechanisms, and price tags that made accountants wince. The story begins in 1942 at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where a civilian engineer named Leslie Skinner and an Army officer named Edward Ull were facing an impossible problem. American infantry had no reliable way to stop German tanks. Anti-tank rifles were too weak. Mines required perfect placement. Artillery was too slow. Soldiers were being slaughtered by armored vehicles they couldn't fight back against. All had an idea that seemed almost childish in its simplicity. Take a rocket, put it in a tube, let a soldier aim the tube at a tank, fire the rocket. The concept violated every principle of sophisticated weapons design, but Ull didn't care about sophistication. He cared about dead soldiers. In the spring of 1942, he grabbed a piece of steel tubing from a scrap pile, attached a simple electrical firing mechanism, and walked out to the firing range. The first test rocket flew straight and true, punching through a quarter-inch of armor plate at 60 yards. Officers watching the demonstration stood in stunned silence. Within weeks, the weapon was approved for mass production. Within months, American soldiers were carrying bazookas into combat in North Africa. The weapon worked exactly as promised, giving infantry squads the power to destroy tanks without calling for support. But the bazooka had problems that would eventually lead to its rejection. The weapon produced a massive backblast that revealed the shooter's position to every enemy within 100 yards. The rockets themselves were slow and couldn't penetrate the thickest armor on newer Soviet and German tanks. The weapon required 2 soldiers to operate effectively. one to aim and fire, another to load rockets. And perhaps most damaging, the bazooka looked primitive compared to the guided missiles and recoilless rifles being developed in the 1950s and 1960s. American military leadership made a decision that seemed obvious at the time. They developed replacement weapons like the M72 Law, a disposable single-shot rocket that could be carried by one soldier. They invested in wire-guided missiles like the Tau and Dragon systems. They poured money into sophisticated anti-tank platforms that promised perfect accuracy and devastating power. The old bazooka, with its simple tube and unguided rockets, was quietly shuffled out of frontline units. By the 1970s, the bazooka had virtually disappeared from American military inventory. The weapons were sold as surplus, donated to allied nations, or simply destroyed. Military academies stopped teaching bazooka tactics. Training manuals were updated to remove references to the obsolete system. A generation of American soldiers grew up never seeing one outside a museum. But the bazooka didn't die. It scattered across the globe like seeds from a dying plant, taking root in places where sophistication meant nothing and reliability meant everything. Surplus bazookas ended up in the hands of dozens of nations, from South American armies to African militias to Middle Eastern resistance groups. And in those places, far from American oversight, the weapon began to evolve. The Soviet Union had captured bazookas during World War II and immediately saw their potential. Soviet engineers reverse-engineered the design and created their own version, calling it the RPG-2. That weapon led to the RPG-7, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that borrowed the bazooka's basic concept but added refinements that fixed many of its flaws. The RPG-7 had better rockets, simpler operation, and legendary reliability. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union was manufacturing RPG-7s by the millions, distributing them to communist allies and revolutionary movements worldwide. Vietnam became the proving ground where the bazooka's descendants humiliated American technological superiority. Viet Cong fighters used RPG-7s to destroy American armored personnel carriers, helicopters, and fortified positions. The weapons were simple enough that peasant farmers could learn to fire them in an afternoon. They were durable enough to survive burial in jungle mud for months. And they were effective enough to force American forces to completely rethink their tactics. American military analysts watched this happen with growing horror, but they refused to admit their mistake. Instead, they doubled down on complexity, developing even more sophisticated anti-tank weapons with even higher price tags. The cycle continued through the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s. American weapons got smarter, more expensive, and more dependent on electronics and batteries, and the bazooka's descendants got cheaper, simpler, and more widespread. The weapon's resurrection truly began in the conflicts of the 21st century. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces encountered enemies armed with RPG-7s and similar weapons derived from the original bazooka concept. These weapons couldn't penetrate the armor on an M1 Abrams tank, but they didn't need to. They attacked supply trucks, personnel carriers, buildings, and helicopters. They were light enough to hide in a marketplace and powerful enough to destroy a vehicle worth millions of dollars. And they cost less than a smartphone. Then came Ukraine in 2022, and the bazooka's legacy reached its final, devastating vindication. Ukrainian forces found themselves facing a Russian armored invasion with limited supplies of modern Western anti-tank weapons. They turned to their stockpiles of Soviet-era RPG-7s and similar systems, weapons that many Western analysts had written off as obsolete decades earlier. And those simple, cheap, supposedly outdated weapons began destroying Russian tanks at a rate that shocked military observers worldwide. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Footage emerged daily showing Ukrainian soldiers using RPG-7s and similar weapons to ambush Russian armored columns. The tactics were identical to those used with the original bazooka 80 years earlier. Hide, wait for the enemy to approach, fire from close range, and disappear. The weapons worked because they were simple enough to use under stress, reliable enough to function in terrible conditions, and cheap enough to distribute to every squad that needed them. Russian forces faced the same weapon from the other side. Their own RPG-7s and modernized versions proved equally effective against Ukrainian armor. The conflict became a strange mirror image, with both sides using descendants of a weapon the United States had rejected 50 years earlier. And the sophisticated, expensive Western anti-tank systems, when they arrived, proved no more effective than the crude rockets that cost a fraction of the price. The effectiveness of these simple rocket launchers in modern warfare is documented across multiple conflicts and sources. Combat footage from Ukraine shows successful engagements against main battle tanks using weapons that trace their lineage directly to the World War II bazooka. Military analysts from multiple nations have published assessments confirming that simple, unguided rockets remain highly effective when used with proper tactics. Manufacturing data reveals the scale of the weapon's resurrection. The RPG-7, direct descendant of the bazooka concept, is the most widely produced anti-tank weapon in human history. Estimates suggest over 9 million units have been manufactured since the 1960s. Production continues today in multiple countries, including Russia, China, and several former Soviet republics. The weapon is in active service with the militaries of over 40 nations. Cost comparisons tell a stark story about military priorities. A modern American Javelin missile system costs approximately $200,000 per unit, with each missile costing an additional $80,000. An RPG-7 launcher costs between $500 and $2,000 depending on the manufacturer. The rockets cost between $50 and $500 each. A single Javelin missile costs more than an entire squad's worth of RPG-7s with ammunition. Effectiveness data from recent conflicts challenges assumptions about technological superiority. According to compiled battle reports, simple rocket launchers achieved similar kill rates against armored vehicles compared to sophisticated guided systems when used at appropriate ranges. The limiting factor wasn't the weapon's sophistication, but the tactical.
The resurrection of these simple weapons has had profound effects on the soldiers who use them and face them. Infantry troops who once felt helpless against armored vehicles now have reliable tools that let them fight back. This psychological shift cannot be overstated. Knowing you can destroy a tank changes everything about how you approach combat. It transforms infantry from victims of armor into hunters of armor. But the weapons have also extracted terrible costs. Because simple rocket launchers are so widespread and easy to use, they've proliferated into the hands of irregular forces, insurgents, and groups that operate outside international law. This has extended conflicts and increased civilian casualties in urban warfare. The same simplicity that makes these weapons effective for conventional armies makes them attractive to anyone who wants to attack armored vehicles, fortified positions, or even buildings with no military purpose. Soldiers on both sides of conflicts describe the constant psychological pressure of knowing that any window, any doorway, any pile of rubble could hide someone with a rocket launcher. Armored vehicle crews report that the stress of operating in areas where simple anti-tank weapons are common is exhausting and demoralizing. The mental burden of vulnerability persists even inside vehicles designed to be invulnerable. Every moment outside secure bases becomes a calculated risk. The bazooka's journey from rejection to resurrection reveals something fundamental about how militaries think about weapons and warfare. Organizations, especially large military establishments, develop institutional cultures that value certain qualities over others. In the decades after World War II, Western militaries fell in love with technological sophistication. They believed that the side with better technology would always win. This belief drove them to create weapons that were marvels of engineering, but sometimes forgot the basic realities of combat. Think of it like this. Imagine you need to dig a hole. You could buy a simple shovel for $20,
Or you could buy a remote-controlled robotic excavator for $10,000. The excavator is more impressive. It has sensors, cameras, and precision controls. But if the hole only needs to be 3 feet deep, and you need to dig it in a place with no electricity to charge the excavator's batteries, and you need to dig it right now, the simple shovel will do the job better. That's what happened with anti-tank weapons. Military theorists call this the complexity trap. When organizations compete primarily on technological advancement, they create systems that work brilliantly under perfect conditions, but fail in the chaos of real combat. Complex weapons need perfect maintenance, perfect training, perfect supply chains, and perfect operating conditions. Simple weapons just need someone to point them and pull the trigger. In a long war where supply chains collapse and trained personnel become casualties, simplicity becomes the ultimate advantage. The bazooka's descendants' resurrection also demonstrates something important about military procurement and institutional learning. Organizations are very slow to admit mistakes, especially expensive mistakes. Western militaries spent decades and billions of dollars developing sophisticated anti-tank systems. Admitting that simpler weapons might work just as well would require acknowledging that money was wasted and that institutional priorities were wrong. This is psychologically very difficult for large organizations to do. There's a broader lesson here about how innovation actually works in warfare. We tend to think that military technology moves in a straight line from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. But the bazooka story shows that progress isn't linear. Sometimes the older, simpler solution is actually better for the conditions that matter. Sometimes innovation means recognizing what works and refusing to replace it just because something fancier comes along. The weapon's legacy also speaks to the nature of asymmetric warfare and how small forces can challenge large ones. When a weapon is simple enough and cheap enough, it becomes democratized. Any group with modest resources can acquire it. This levels the battlefield in ways that expensive weapons cannot. A peasant militia armed with RPG-7s can threaten the same tanks that cost millions and took years to build. This fundamentally changes the calculus of military intervention and occupation. Historians will likely see the bazooka's resurrection as a case study of institutional blindness and the danger of assuming that more expensive always means better. It's a reminder that the fog of war affects not just battlefield decisions, but also the decisions made in peacetime about what weapons to build and why. The most important question isn't how advanced a weapon is, it's whether it will still work when everything else has failed. Here's what we know for certain. A weapon the United States rejected as obsolete has become one of the most effective tools in modern ground warfare. Simple, cheap rocket launchers derived from the World War II bazooka are destroying tanks, changing tactics, and forcing militaries worldwide to reconsider their assumptions about technological superiority. What we don't know is whether this represents a permanent shift or a temporary gap in how modern militaries think about weapons. We don't know if the lesson being learned is the right one, or if institutional momentum will push forces back toward complexity once these current conflicts end. But one thing is becoming clear. The story of this weapon isn't over. In fact, it might just be beginning its most important chapter. In the immediate future, we're likely to see continued production and distribution of simple rocket launcher systems across multiple militaries. The evidence from recent conflicts is too strong to ignore, even for institutions resistant to change. Confidence level? High. Western militaries will probably adopt a mixed approach, maintaining their expensive guided systems while also increasing procurement of simpler backup weapons. This allows them to preserve their technological identity while acknowledging the practical lessons from recent wars. We're already seeing signs of this in updated procurement requests and training programs. Confidence level medium to high. The defense industry will attempt to create a middle ground, developing weapons that are simpler than current guided systems but more sophisticated than basic rocket launchers. Some of these will succeed, but many will fall into the same complexity trap, trying to be everything to everyone and ending up less effective than either extreme. Confidence level, medium. There will likely be significant changes in how armored vehicles are designed and deployed. If simple rockets can reliably threaten expensive tanks, then tanks either need better active protection systems or completely different tactical roles. Some militaries may reduce their emphasis on heavy armor entirely, shifting resources to lighter, faster vehicles that are cheaper to lose. Confidence level, medium. Drone technology may eventually render both simple and complex rocket launchers partially obsolete. Small drones carrying precision munitions could offer many of the advantages of simple rockets, the precision of guided missiles, and even lower costs. But this transition will take years and may prove more complicated than current enthusiasts expect. Confidence level, low to medium. The broader lesson will probably influence military procurement across all weapon categories, not just anti-tank systems. Militaries might start asking harder questions about whether complexity actually delivers value or whether it just delivers higher contractor profits. This could lead to a renaissance in simple, reliable weapon design. Confidence level, low. What's almost certain is that the debate about this weapon will continue. Every new conflict will provide fresh evidence that either supports or challenges the lesson of the bazooka's resurrection. Military academies will write case studies, contractors will lobby for their preferred interpretations, and soldiers will continue to use whatever works best in the desperate reality of combat. The weapon the United States threw away became the weapon the world couldn't live without. That's not a story about one rocket launcher. It's a story about how we think, how we learn, and how we decide what matters when lives are on the line. The next time you hear about a new weapon system with an impressive price tag and incredible capabilities, remember the bazooka. Remember that the most important question isn't how advanced a weapon is. It's whether it will still work when everything else has failed. If you want to understand how another underlooked innovation changed warfare forever, watch our video on the weapon that won the Battle of the Atlantic but almost never got built. It's a story that rhymes with this one in ways that will surprise you. This video discussed weapons in warfare with minimal graphic content. All information presented is from public sources, and situations discussed are subject to ongoing developments and updates. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Fixes of World War II. We bring you the untold stories of the weapons, tactics, and innovations that changed history, but rarely make it into the textbooks. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges what you think you know about warfare.